This is the 60-second recording in the Kingdom Cassette Service Series produced by the Federation of the Covenant People, P.O. Box 830 Honeydew 2040, South Africa. This is part 7 in our discussion of the law of liberty within the Kingdom Cassette Service Series, and I have called this recording Weights and Measures. In part 6, in this particular series on the law of liberty, we drew attention to the Lord's directive concerning the health of his people. And as we have seen, there was nothing haphazard in his directions, for no matter how conscientious a person may be in observing the food laws, no matter how zealous in differentiating between clean and unclean foods, if the source producing the food is deficient, the food cannot be other than deficient itself. Thus, as we have seen, the Lord's directive centers on the soil, which we as Israelites are commanded to ensure is a healthy foundation producing the nation's food, and which, so we are commanded, must enjoy its Sabbath of rest. Needless to say, we have failed in applying this basic principle to the national land Sabbaths, and under the pressure of modern economics, year in and year out, and with an ever-increasing quantity of chemical fertilizers, we force the exhausted soil to yield its supply of nutritionally deficient food. If we look at our people today, the Anglo-Celto-Saxon and kindred nations, we are a reflection of the soil of the land inheritance which the Lord our God gave us. We are a sick, exhausted, and very inert people, and instead of the healthy, happy, virile people showing forth the praises of He who said we would do this, we have become introverts, preoccupied with our own survival. The Lord said, "If ye hearken unto me," which of course is followed by the description of a nation which is the very antithesis of any of that which obtains anywhere in the world today. The point that I would like to make here is that no one has ever given God's way a chance, and strangely enough, the very people to whom the Lord committed his Constitution are in the forefront of those who maintain that the Constitution itself has become null and void, and that all these statutes, commandments, and judgments were divinely abrogated when Christ was murdered by the Jews. You know, my friends, something is very awry here, for despite the theologically proclaimed metamorphosis of the unclean to a clean status, and this because Christ was murdered by the Jews, we, the true modern development of God's covenant Israel people, are suffering everything which the law prescribes for the violation of its dictates. How can each and every one of the prescribed consequences for law violation be applicable today if the law itself has been abrogated? Believe me, my friends, whether we like it or not, whether we acknowledge it or not, ranging from the tyranny of government right down to our personal frame of mind, is precisely the situation as it was prescribed to Israel for law violation. Now, having said this, let us pass on. But before we do, I'd like to say that the eating of clean food and the not eating of clean food was an individual's prerogative. And as far as is known, no section of the Levitical civil servants was set up to enforce those food laws. No statute was written into the Constitution which said that if a person was found guilty of eating unclean food, he was to be brought before the judges and sentenced accordingly. The command of the Lord was given, and given for our good. And if we thought, or if we think we know better than the Lord, well then, we must pay for this folly ourselves. So then, the choice lay with the individual. Both clean and unclean foods were available, and an Israelite was free to exercise his preference, and he alone would suffer the consequences. But there were other areas in the Constitution where individual choice no longer operated, where the individual, in common with the whole nation, was indeed part and parcel of a whole. That area, my friends, was the area of money. Now, the first thing that I would like to say here is that we should not assume that our Israelite forebears indulged in a barter system, which system, as we know, is that in which a commodity is given in exchange for another commodity estimated to be equivalent in value. Israel's constitution, my friends, was given against the background of an already developed economic system, and I would like to establish this before we continue any further. It will be recalled that Abraham was born in Ur of the Chaldees, and that a considerable portion of his life was governed by the enforced rules which have been called the Code of Hammurabi. Now, according to Bennett's translation of this code, a working man exchanged his labor not for goods considered to be equivalent to the services rendered, but for money, the wage being calculated at 8 shekels a year. So then, the first point which strikes us is that money was in circulation in the 2nd millennium BC, having at some time or other displaced the old barter system, although just when this happened no one seems to have known. Now, of course, it may be contended that the Code of Hammurabi, while being of undoubted historical interest, does not necessarily indicate a money-based system in operation in Abraham's life after he left Ur of the Chaldees. Fair enough. Let's take a look at the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And you know that we find there the English word money referred to in 61 different references. And while some may say that money is a very poor translation of the Hebrew word, which was kesef, a little research will show that this is not entirely accurate. Kesef, according to Gesenius in his Hebrew-English lexicon, and certainly supported by James Strong in his concordance, indicates a commodity which is characterized by its pale color, silver and gold being seen in this light, and invariably described when the Hebrew text uses the word kesef. Now, whether or not Abram had silver and gold when he left Ur for Haran, or when he left Haran to live in Canaan, is not told. All that is said is that he gathered all his substance and went and lived in Canaan. We then read that there was a famine in the land of Canaan, and that Abram took his family and went down into Egypt, where, according to the authorized version, Abram passed Sarah off as his sister, although, according to the Book of Jubilees, which is certainly non-canonical, no such act was attributed to Abraham. In this statement, in this Book of Jubilees, it is stated that the Pharaoh seized Sarah, and as though to justify his act, he gave Abram sheep, cattle, men servants, and a host of other things. Now, when the Pharaoh discovered that Sarah was Abram's wife, he immediately returned her to him, with instructions that they quit Egypt. And in the 1st and 2nd verses of the 13th chapter of Genesis, we read, Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him into the south. And Abram was very rich in cattle, in silver, and in gold. The point at issue here is to determine whether or not Abram went into Egypt with silver and gold, or whether he acquired this together with cattle, which he brought out of the land of the Pharaoh. Dr. Bullinger, in his companion Bible, appears to have been of the opinion that Abram acquired this in Egypt, silver and gold, so he says, being scarce in Palestine, but plentiful in Egypt, while, according to the Pentateuch and the Haftorah, which is edited by Rabbi Hertz, the literal translation of the Hebrew text would suggest that Abram acquired cattle, silver, and gold in Egypt, and that he returned heavily laden with possessions which he did not have when he went into that land. Well, be that as it may, there can be very little doubt that Abram became a very wealthy man in Canaan, and there can be no doubt that apart from the cattle and sheep, his wealth was measured against the standard of wealth as this had come to be accepted throughout the whole of the Middle East. Now, to confirm this, although I will enlarge on the standards in a few moments, to confirm this, I would like to draw your attention to Genesis 23:16, where we have the account of Abraham's purchase of a burial place for Sarah, and which reads, And Abraham hearkened unto Ephron. And Abram weighed to Ephron the silver which he had named in the audience of the sons of Heth, 400 shekels of silver, current money, with the merchant. Now from this, and bearing in mind that the English word money is not in the original, you can confirm this by noting that it is written in italics in the authorized version, which certainly indicates that it is an interpolation. From this, it is patently obvious that 400 shekels was currently used in transactions by the Canaanites, the word merchant being interchangeable with Canaanite. Canaan itself, as you will recall, means trafficker or merchant. Another incident in which we find money or currency in use is to be found in an earlier reference in Genesis 20, verse 16 to be precise, where after a repetition of the Sarah-Pharaoh incident, in which Abram passed Sarah off as his sister, we find Abimelech telling Sarah, "Behold, I have given thy brother 1,000 pieces of silver." The word pieces again here being in italics, and therefore not in the original. The point to discover here is 1,000 what of silver. Now, any researcher into this subject will find that coinage, that is, a single coin with which we are so familiar today, was totally unknown during the period of the Egyptian, Assyrian, and Babylonian empires, and that it was also unknown during Israel's sojourn in Canaan. The first coins as such to reach Canaan were those of Darius of Persia, who in 485 BC struck two coins, one gold and one silver, known as the darik and the siglos, respectively. It was only in 139 BC, or thereabouts, that Simon Maccabeus was granted the right by Antiochus Sidetes to coin indigenous Judean money, the record of this being found in the apocryphal book, the first book of Maccabees, the 15th chapter, and from verse 5 onwards. This coin was labeled a shekel, but as this was merely the revival of a denomination of currency which had lapsed some 3 centuries earlier, well, I'll leave this to a later consideration and confirm it to you. Now, you might recall, of course, that in the modern Israeli state, which was set up in 1948, they too have revived the use of the old shekel. And if you'll bear with me, I would like to show that the word shekel has a very, very strong affinity with ancient Babylon when it was an empire. Now, in turning our attention to the empires of antiquity, with particular reference to Egypt, after all, this is where Abraham apparently got his wealth in silver and gold, we find that the Egyptians weighed their precious metals, and then when it became necessary to pay a fixed amount, the gold or silver was made into a ring, the size and weight of the ring being determined by the considered value of the article for which payment was being made. Now, at this point, I'd like to enlist the aid of Dr. William Smith, who in his authoritative Bible dictionary has this to say about those self-same money rings. Dr. Smith wrote, I quote, "The gold rings found in the Celtic countries have been held to have had the same use as in Egypt. It has indeed been argued that this could not have been the case in the Celtic countries, since they show no monetary system. Yet it is evident from their weights that they all contain complete multiples or parts of a unit, so that we may fairly suppose that the Celts, before they used coins, had, like the Egyptians, the practice of keeping money in rings, which they weighed when making the necessary payments. We have no certain record of the use of ring money or other uncoined money in antiquity except amongst the Egyptians. With them, the practice amounts up to a remote age, and was probably as constant and perhaps as regulated with respect to the weight of the rings as a coinage. It can scarcely be doubted that the highly civilized rivals of the Egyptians, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, adopted, if they did not originate, this custom, clay tablets having been found specifying grants of money by weight, and there is therefore every probability that this system obtained in Palestine as well. Now, that is the end of this quote from Dr. William Smith, and I'm sure that you will agree with me that it tells a tremendous story of trade intercourse between the Middle East and all the Celtic countries as well, and that their currency, if we can call it currency, was now governed by the weight of the actual object which was used as money. Now, there is, of course, no positive evidence that the ring money of Egypt was used in Israel, although it's patently obvious that the Israelites borrowed silver and gold when they left the land. And the children of Israel did according to the words of Moses, and they borrowed of the Egyptians jewels of silver and jewels of gold and raiment. This, of course, is found in Exodus 12, verse 35. The phrases jewels of silver and jewels of gold would on the surface appear to indicate the possibility that Egypt's ring money could have been meant here, particularly as the Hebrew word keli is used and translated as jewels. Keli, although being somewhat obscure in origin, is generally thought to have as meaning something that is made, and apart from jewels could indicate any apparatus, any utensil, any vessel, any furniture. It merely indicates something that was fashioned. Now, ring money, of course, could fall into this definition of the word, but I feel that if the silver and gold which Israel brought out of Egypt was, in fact, the Egyptian ring money, the Hebrew text would record the word nezem instead of keli, because nezem is most specific in its meaning. It means an earring, a nose ring, or any other like object. It means a circle or a ring. Now, while we do not know the exact nature of the jewels of silver and gold that was brought out of Egypt, we do know that Israel possessed both of these metals at Sinai and later when they took possession of Canaan. We now come to a very, very important question: whether in his law the Lord repudiated the use of gold and silver as currency and equitable payments for goods or services, or whether he simply rejected the whole thing out of hand. Now, let it be said at once, there is no evidence in the law that the Lord was opposed to the system of a specific currency as a genuine medium for the exchange of goods. As certain specifics were laid down in this respect of currency, it would serve at this point, my friends, for us to spend a few moments looking at the value of the economic system as it obtained in Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria, and which, because of the geography of Canaan, was applicable to Israel as well. Now, I have just drawn your attention to the fact that the silver and gold which Israel took out of Egypt is merely described as jewels of silver and gold, and that the Hebrew word translated jewels is keli, as distinct from nezem, which means rings. From this, we may infer that the ring money may have undergone a change, and that ingots or wedges of the metals had replaced the rings. Now, this view, of course, is supported if we consider the story of Jericho and the looting of that city as recorded in Joshua 7:21, where we find Achan reporting the findings of a wedge of gold, or a tongue of gold, of 50 shekels weight, a fact which would certainly suggest the replacement of rings with wedges or ingots. At least, my friends, we can say that it did obtain in Canaan, being found in Jericho when the Israelites came in and devastated that city. Well, be that as it may, from the evidence which we have to hand at the moment, it would appear that at this time, that is the time of Israel's national organization and the giving of its constitution, it would appear that popular quantities of silver and gold were made into ingots, and that these, because of their specific weights, were called by what we may term currency denominations, being known as the talent, the mina, the shekel, and the gerah. The talent, that is the largest denomination, weighed, as near as we can evaluate it, approximately 30 kilograms. When you think of Solomon's revenue for 1 year, which in 1 Kings 10:14 is set at 666 talents of gold, this would amount to 19,800 kilograms of gold, a prodigious figure. One could indeed say that we have here the earlier version of Fort Knox. Now, initially, 1 talent comprised 60 minas, 1 mina being approximately 500 grams, while 1 mina comprised 60 shekels, 1 shekel weighing approximately 11 grams. A shekel comprised 20 gerahs, with 1 gerah weighing approximately half a gram. Now, at some unspecified time, and for reasons not given in any of the reference books that I have in my library, Babylon changed its sexagesimal system, that is, a system in which its denominations were divided into 60 equal parts, to the decimal system, in which 50 minas comprised 1 talent, and 50 shekels made 1 mina. Now, a lot of speculation has been made about how, why, and wherefore this change was adopted. Now, I can only suggest that the change may have had something to do with the pressures exerted by the then center of world trade. You will, of course, recall that Sidon, up there in Phoenicia, as the earlier philosophers and historians contend, was the center of the then world trade, a dominion which was subsequently passed southwards to Tyre, which Isaiah in his 23rd chapter refers to as the daughter of Sidon. While the change to decimalization may have been because of trade pressures from Sidon and Tyre, what is a fact is that after the downfall of Babylon in 536, the 4 denominations, that is now the talent, the mina, the shekel, and the gerah, passed from usage. And as I've said earlier, Persian and Phoenician coinages began to circulate. Now, this, however, is getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, so I would like to return to Sinai and the stipulations of the law within the then existing monetary system. Now, as I have said, the 4 denominations, the talent, the mina, the shekel, and the gerah, were weights of either gold or silver. And it's very interesting to note that in his law, the Lord accepts the existing principles and only demands total honesty in the application of these. In Leviticus 19, verses 35 to 37, we read, "Ye shall do no unrighteousness in judgment, in meat yard, in weight, or in measure. Just balances, just weights, a just ephah, a just hin shall ye have, for I am the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt. Therefore shall ye observe all my statutes and all my judgments, and do them. I am the Lord." Now, for further clarification, I would like to quote the New English Bible translation of this passage, which reads, "You shall not pervert justice in measurement of length, weight, or quantity. You shall have true scales, true weights, true measures, dry and liquid. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt." Now, I find this rather significant, that the Lord appends this statement concerning just weights, just measurements, and all that, with this statement, "I am the Lord that brought you out of Egypt," which would suggest, to my way of thinking anyhow, that the violation of these principles was that which obtained in the land of Egypt. They did not have just weights or just measures. Now, in Deuteronomy 25:13, we have the second reference to this, and again I quote from the New English Bible translation. "You shall not have unequal weights in your bag, one heavy and the other light. You shall not have unequal measures in your house, one large and the other small. You shall have true and correct weights and true and correct measures, so that you may live long in the land which the Lord your God is giving you." Now, these 2 passages embody all the principles in the economic law of the Lord, and while some may feel that as only 6 verses are devoted to it in the law, its importance is only minor. I, my friends, am of the opinion that the whole national structure of Israel hangs on these 6 verses. And this being so, let us spend a few moments looking at what appears to be a very meager biblical account on a very vital, fundamental national issue. Now, in the Authorized Version, this subject is introduced with the words, "Ye shall do no unrighteousness in judgment," while the New English Bible translation has it as, "You shall not pervert justice," which in the plainest of language tells that infringements of the commands concerning just weights and just measures falls within the province of the judiciary in the community, and that it is thus the national responsibility to ensure that honest goods and honest payments characterize all transactions. So the judiciary is involved with this matter. Now, if we consider Deuteronomy 16:18 through 20, we see the formulation of this judiciary, which reads, "Judges and officers shalt thou make thee in all thy gates, which the Lord thy God giveth thee throughout thy tribes, and they shall judge the people with just judgment. Thou shalt not wrest judgment. Thou shalt not respect persons, neither take a gift, for a gift doth blind the eyes of the wise and pervert the words of righteousness. That which is altogether just shalt thou follow, that thou mayest live and inherit the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee." Now, if we consider 2 Chronicles 19:8, we note that the Levites and the chief of the fathers of Israel comprised this judiciary, and it became incumbent upon them to ensure that honesty, in the true sense of the meaning, was applied in Israel. Now, if we continue, we note that the meat yard occupies priority in the function of the judiciary, and as this has to do with the measurement of lengths, it opens up a very wide area which was to be kept under strict judicial surveillance. Perhaps the most important in this area had to do with the measurement of the area of a person's land inheritance. And then, as now, there was always the danger of a neighbor encroaching on another's land by removing the boundary markers. The meat yard, which the judiciary was honor bound to oversee, read, "Thou shalt not remove thy neighbor's landmark, which they of old time have set in thine inheritance, which thou shalt inherit in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee to possess it." While in Deuteronomy 27:17, it states, "Cursed be he that removeth his neighbor's landmark." So then, the meat yard, far from being limited to material and other goods which are sold according to measurement, may be seen in a very, very much wider aspect, the commands of the Lord being seen as militating against any and all fraudulent practices in terms of the measurement of anything. Now, in continuing with our discussion on the powers and the responsibilities, nay, let's say the duty of the judiciary in terms of the law, we find in passing to the second area, that is after the meat yard, that we come to the prohibition against fraudulent weights, and in this we are immediately thrust into an area which is of vital concern to each and every one of us. You will recall that we've already discussed the fact that the subject of weights before and at the time of the giving of the law, that this was inextricably involved with currency, the denominations of quantities of silver and gold being determined by weights. So then, this command for just weights becomes a prohibition against fraudulent currency or fraudulent money. And you know, there can be very little doubt that the prohibition was certainly justified, for if we consider the developments which took place in Israel, we see that one of the many charges leveled against Israel was that of fraudulent money. Now, the Bible does not say how it was injected into the Israel people. The Bible does not identify those who were responsible for it being practiced in Israel. Now, let us be perfectly frank here, my friends. I do not believe that our Israel people were paragons of virtue, by no manner of means. But I do believe that our forebears, just like ourselves, were rightly categorized as sheep. You know, the Lord speaks of us as sheep. Well now, are not sheep led Are they not a very, very stupid animal being led by all and sundry? And this is what I believe was basically the responsibility. This was that which was responsible for the downfall of Israel in all its departments. They were induced into a phony religion. They were induced into a phony way of life. And they were induced into practicing fraudulent money as well. So then, let us prove it. Let us go and have a look at one of the many charges that was leveled against the nation. And for this I want to refer you to the first chapter in the book of Isaiah, and in verse 22, where we read, "Thy silver is become dross, thy wine mixed with water," which is an undoubted reference to false weights and false measures, in that the silver had become alloyed with baser metals, while the wine, which was measured in baths, hins, cabs, logs, had been watered down to make up in volume what it lacked in quantity. Now, since Isaiah's day, and despite the indictment of the Lord against fraudulent money, things have not improved, and we today are suffering from an extension of that very system, in that our money today is based on unbacked or perhaps partially backed paper money, which has an inbuilt machinery of inflation caused by the debt and credit system, with no other solution but greater debt and its attendant misery and suffering. The Lord God of Israel instructed his people that no matter what they called their currency, talent, mina, shekel, or gerah, the name must be a credible expression characterizing the true value of that which it describes. The expression just weights, as I have said, militating against fraudulent money. Now, before we pass on and come into modern times, I would like to draw your attention to the account in Matthew 21, verse 12, which deals with the story of our Lord overthrowing the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves. The temple had, of course, its own currency at that time, and this is a feature which directs our attention back to Exodus 30, verses 12 to 16, where we have what is known as the sanctuary shekel, or as it is described in the Jewish Encyclopedia, the temple shekel. Now, I'd like to read these verses to you because they lead in the end to the account in Matthew 21 where our Lord drove out the money changers. Now, this is what is recorded in Exodus 30, and I'd like you to take special note of what is written. "When thou takest the sum of the children of Israel after their numbers, then shall they give every man a ransom for his soul unto the Lord when thou numberest them, that there be no plague among them when thou numberest them. This they shall give, every one that passeth among them that are numbered, half a shekel after the shekel of the sanctuary." A shekel is 20 gerahs. "And half a shekel shall be the offering unto the Lord. The rich shall not give more, and the poor shall not give less than half a shekel, when they give an offering unto the Lord to make an atonement for your souls. And thou shalt take the atonement money of the children of Israel, and shall appoint it for the services of the tabernacle of the congregation, that it may be for a memorial unto the children of Israel before the Lord, to make an atonement for your souls." My friends, I do not believe that the Lord ever said that. And if you look at it again objectively, you must surely agree. Since when did the Lord suggest that you buy an atonement of your souls? This, I believe, is just another one of those tears sown into the Constitution. And to confirm this, I would like to direct you to the Jewish Encyclopedia, which states that in the Mishnah, which is a collection of traditional teachings of the law, and on which the Talmud, of course, is based, in the Mishnah, in Bekeroth, chapter 8, verse 7, it states, "All payments according to the shekel of the sanctuary are to be made in Phoenician currency." This, my friends, tells you exactly that the temples or the sanctuary shekel was not commanded by the Lord, but a later priesthood who put these words into the mouth of the Lord, demanding that the shekel be paid in Phoenician currency. Phoenician currency was not in circulation in Palestine until after Israel had been removed from the land, and it could only be after that time that Phoenician currency could be used in the temple as the temple shekel. Now, whether the Maccabean shekel, coined, as I said earlier, in and round about 139 BC, replaced the Phoenician currency, I do not know. But I am inclined to the opinion that the Phoenician currency remained temple money because all people, the locals as well as those visiting Jerusalem and the temple, were required to buy temple money, the rate of exchange being fixed by the exchangers, as they are called in Matthew 25:27, which is written as trapezes in Greek, and which literally means money broker or banker. The Lord's reaction against this fraudulent money of the temple and the temple brokers is thus perfectly understandable, as it violates anything that is found in the law of the Lord. Now, bearing in mind that the Lord accused the Israel people of fraudulent money when he said that their silver had become dross, if we pass from that time to when, according to Hosea 6, when the Lord said he would begin to raise up his people, we find that this brings us to the time of the Reformation. And the significant feature of the history of that time is that the Anglo-Saxon people picked up exactly where Israel in Canaan left off. They were subjected to fraudulent money. The Bank of England, of course, was formed in 1694, and if I may, I would like to quote from the Encyclopaedia Britannica in its opening remarks concerning banking, and this is what it says. A bank, in its simplest form, is an institution where money may be deposited for safekeeping. But banks are usually established to lend as well as receive money, and the profits of a banker are commonly derived from the excess of the interest he receives from those indebted to him over the interest he allows, so far as he allows any, to those who have deposited money with him, unquote. Now this, of course, is a simplification of that vast modern structure which we call banking. But what I would like to do here is, before we see the fraudulent money in the true sense of the word in operation, is to consider very, very briefly the history of Europe before the Bank of England was established. Now, you may feel that I'm deviating from the law of the Lord at this time, but please bear with me, as I hope to show that despite the opportunities offered when the Bible became an open book, we, the true modern development of God's covenant people, have allowed ourselves to be conned into doing exactly the same thing for which our forebears in Canaan were expelled from the land. Now, the first point in history to which I would like to direct your attention is the late Middle Ages, where the expanding European trade, encouraged by the Crusades against Islam, had produced the first banks which were centered, believe it or not, in Italy. At that time, England was a wild, developing country with its exports of wool offering the prospect of big profits. But due to its unsettled condition, the Italian bankers were only prepared to engage in limited financial ventures. However, if we consider the activities of Edward I, we see that he attributed much of the unsettled conditions in England to the iniquitous money system as it was then operated, and in 1275 he issued a statute in which he specifically drew attention to this, and I quote very, very briefly from the Statutes of the Realm, Volume 1, page 221, which reads in part, I quote it, this is from Edward, "Forasmuch as the king hath seen that divers evils and the disinheriting of good men of his land have happened by the usuries which the Jews have made in the time past, and that divers sins have followed thereupon, albeit that he and his ancestors have received much benefit from the Jewish people in all times past, nevertheless, for the honor of God and the common benefit of the people, the king hath ordained and established that from henceforth no Jew shall lend anything at usury, either upon land or upon rent or upon any other thing." That's the end of the quote. This statute was, of course, ignored, and within 15 years the king expelled the Jews from England. We know, of course, that they returned under Cromwell, who was financed from Jewish sources in Holland. Now, having been deprived of the finance which was generated by the Jews, the king found himself at a loss as how to continue with his wars, and it was at this point that the agents of the Florentine banks, the Bardi and the Peruzzi, moved to London, lending money to finance the wars which could be repaid from tax on wool exports. Now, when Edward III came to the throne, this was in 1327, he was confident that he could get his own English merchants to finance his wars, and because of this he defaulted on England's Italian debts, and the banks of Bardi and Peruzzi collapsed. Now, this, however, did not end the Italian monopoly that it enjoyed as the chief moneylender, because by the middle of the 15th century, Cosimo de' Medici had established a bank which was far more sophisticated than the earlier Florentine bank, and which had branches in the major capitals of Europe. Incidentally, and just by way of interest, the de' Medici Bank controlled the Pope's accounts, which included a very profitable alum monopoly. Cosimo de' Medici's grandson, Lorenzo, who inherited the family enterprise, he was more concerned, my friends, with the Renaissance than with banking, and in consequence his preoccupation in this field caused him to rely heavily on branch managers, and within a very short period he lost entire control over that vast network. Overlending and overborrowing soon took its toll, and one Medici branch after the other began to close down, the whole process, so it is suggested, being begun when the London office, which financed Edward IV in his Wars of the Roses, found the king defaulting in his repayments. Now, while the Italian Medici Bank was on the verge of bankruptcy, other banking institutions in Europe were flourishing, and the public at large, far from learning the lesson of the Medici failure, continued to show its trust in the bankers' formula of extending credit on the basis of monies kept with them for safekeeping. Arising out of this increasing public trust, the first national bank was established in 1674, and was established in Sweden, the first, so it is said, to issue its own notes. 5 years after the Bank of Sweden had been established, we have in England, and under Charles II, an act promulgated in which we may see something of the working of a system which led to the formulation of the Bank of England in 1694. The act stated, whereas several persons, goldsmiths, and others, by taking or borrowing great sums of money, and lending out same again for extraordinary hire or profit, have gained and acquired to themselves the reputation and name of bankers. Now, it's this last portion to which I would like to draw your attention, because of the practice of borrowing for explicit purpose of lending this out for profit. The act stated that those who were involved had gained the reputation of bankers. They were, of course, merely referred to previously as money lenders. I find it rather interesting to note that the word bank derives its meaning from the word bench or table on which the money lenders did their business. Shades, my friends, of the money lenders in the temple whom the Lord drove out. And as their businesses got bigger, they transferred their tables indoors, and the office became known as the bench, or ultimately the bank. And so the Bank of England came into being, the specific mechanism being when a group of merchants agreed to lend £1.2 million to King William III in return for the monopoly on banknotes and the right to receive deposits. Now, the bank continued to finance governments through its bonds, and in this way created what is now called the national debt, a debt which grew from the initial 1.2 million in 1694 to 800 million in 1815. Now, unfortunately, I do not have the current figure of the national debt, but in 1966, the American national debt amounted to $360 billion, from which we may gauge just how much the true Israel people of God are in debt to the moneylenders, and what chance exists under the current system of realizing the true economic liberty which the Lord intended for us when he formed us into a nation. Now, after this very brief review of the history of banking, we could, of course, use several tapes in discussing it more fully. After this brief review, I would like to pass to the currency which was issued. And apart from the notes which were issued, coins were also in use, and we find the Lord's charge, "Your silver has become dross," again very, very valid. In the 1939 edition of Pear's Encyclopedia, we find the statement that gold coinage in Britain consists of 11/12 of fine metal and 1/12 alloy, while in the context of silver it has this to say, I quote, "The first change in the silver standard since the reign of Queen Elizabeth was made in 1920, the new coins being issued early in December, when the degree of fineness was reduced to 500 parts in 1,000 as against 925. This change was necessary owing to the rise in the price of silver, and in order to restore, quote, "the token character of silver coinage. The alloy now consists of 400 parts copper, 50 parts nickel, and 50 parts zinc," unquote. So then, silver has again become dross, while gold has been withdrawn, and certainly makes one wonder at the promise which is written on the Bank of England notes, "I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £1. Have you ever stopped to ask yourself, a pound of what? In passing from the British pound, let us consider the American dollar, and again we ask, what is a dollar? The name itself, that is, the name dollar, derives from the old German Thaler, T-A-L-E-R, which was one of the many large silver coins which were issued by various German states from the 15th to the 19th centuries, all of which varied considerably in weight and in fineness. Now, Webster's Third New International Dictionary defines the dollar in these words, and I quote it. 1. An old German Thaler coin. 2. Any one of a number of coins of various countries patterned after the thaler, as A Spanish or Spanish-American peso, or pieces of 8. B. Any of several coins issued in the United States, as a silver coin issued 1794 to 1935, after 1837, weighing 412.5 grains, or 26.730 grams of silver, 0.900 fine, and a gold coin issued 1848-1889, weighing 25.8 grains, or 1.6718 grams of gold, 0.900 fine. And that is the end of the quote from Webster's dictionary. So then, the American dollar was a coin of specific weight patterned on the old German thaler, but what is the dollar today? This question was submitted to the President of the United States by Merrill E. Jenkins, and I feel that his questions, submitted to when Jimmy Carter was the President, are questions that we could all put to those who issue our so-called money. This is the letter sent to the President of the United States, and I quote it. Dear Mr. President, a Federal Reserve note is labeled note and bears a monetary denomination as $1. It is accepted as being money, a unit of United States currency, and functions as a bearer certificate for the public's goods and services. 1. It cannot be a note, since it does not stipulate payment of anything to anyone by anyone at any time. 2. It is not a dollar. Dollar is an expression of a quantity of silver or gold in coinage, which shall by law be current as money within the United States. 3. It is not money. Money is an abstract term for a medium of exchange. The paper token cannot be the thing that it represents by proxy. 4. It is not currency. Only a medium of exchange itself can be currency. The paper token itself cannot be the thing it represents by proxy. 5. It is not a bearer certificate, since it is not a claim check on the public's goods and services. It represents a 100% confiscation of the public's wealth without compensation. This, my friends, in a nutshell, is what has happened when our people, were not wide awake when the Bible was opened to them, and from which they could see that the Lord our God has given us a perfect system of economics. Instead, our forebears were content to wallow in the misconception that the Lord was only interested in our souls, and such things as our physical and our political well-being was far beneath his consideration. We are surely paying for this today. And if current trends are anything to go on, we are due to pass into even greater monetary slavery than we have ever been in before. Just think back for a moment. The Lord our God said that we should have just weights and just measures, which, in the true sense of the word, indicated that the coin in your pocket was a genuine case of value as money. If you didn't have it, you couldn't go along to the local money lender because no such individual existed. Now, I will be dealing, God willing, with the law of the Lord in the context of loans and repayments in our next recording. But until then, I would like to consider what we have today in place of just weights, just measures in our monetary system. Today we have a plastic thing, which we present as payment for goods or services, and we are allowed 30 days or more to make payment on this. Now, this, of course, is the credit card, an innovation begun when the manager of a small loan company, Frank McNamara, established the Diners Club, which provided select members with credit at 22 restaurants in New York and collected commission on the return for paying the bills promptly. 8 years later, American Express, which already had a world network through its tourist services and travelers' checks, began selling their green and white cards, which afforded 30 days credit to the card holder. By 1980, my friends, American Express had an estimated 10.5 million card holders across the world. Now, after this initial start, banks began to move into this area, and while American Express hammered those with overdue accounts, the banks maintained an unruffled attitude, merely adding interest charges to the interest due on overdue accounts. This business has, of course, become so large that the computer was enlisted to cope with the millions of credits and debits, and before long, appeals for custom, reminders of interest, stern demands for payment were all being chattered out by machines pretending to be human people. The card and its uses broadened and became more versatile, with bank loans as well as short-term credit being offered to shops or restaurants, and the demand today by banks is for more and more automation to cope with the ever-increasing trade in the loans world. A new system is now in the process of being implemented, which is known as the EFT system, which in effect is designed to change the credit card into the debit card, and which, as far as is known, is the first step toward an electronic monetary system. The EFT, or the electronic funds transfer, involves the use of a card which has a magnetic strip on its reverse side, and which, when payment is to be made, is passed through an automatic teller machine at the point of sale terminal. And after the customer's number is punched in, the amount of whatever purchases is made is immediately debited against his or her account. Now, as things are at the moment, the customer's number is still private, and with labor becoming increasingly expensive, the next step is to incorporate the customer's account number on the magnetic strip, which would then do away with the need for cashiers at checkout points. This, so we are told, is the inevitable and logical outcome of our present system, and one that could lead to a long-dreamed-of utopia which would eliminate all crime. Not only will such a cashless society eliminate robberies, murders, and muggings, it will eliminate extortion, blackmail, as well as sounding the death knell for the insidious drug trade. The advantages, so we are told, should be enormous, and mankind as a whole would benefit when EFT is operating, and SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Transactions, links all transactions into one universal banking center. Shades of Babylon all over again, my friends. Much as I would like to continue with this theme, I see that this tape is running out. It usually happens that way. So then, I would like to just close off this discussion by again saying, the Lord said, "Thou shalt not have in thy bag divers weights, a great and a small. Thou shalt not have in thine house divers measures, a great and a small. But thou shalt have a perfect and just weight, a perfect and just measure shalt thou have, that thy days may be lengthened in the land which the Lord thy God given thee." Now, these words sound primitive and archaic when we think of what confronts us in the world of today. But when you think of the principle involved, we, who, if the plans of the ungodly continue unchecked, are about to become financial slaves to an electronic monetary system, we can surely appreciate anew the promise of the Lord, that thy days may be lengthened in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. The principle, my friends, in the economic law of the Lord offers us the perfect law of liberty, just as James put it so long ago. I believe that it can and will be demonstrated by our people in a day not too distant in the future.